I prefer for people to have cake on their birthday rather than not have cake and then a week later say, I'm getting to the fridge and I'm going to eat the whole cake, because I've seen it happen.
Dr. Naidoo, people tend to think that food doesn't impact your brain, but you are a Harvard-trained psychiatrist and nutritionist. You have an outstanding background. Does food actually affect our brain?
Thanks for that question. It actually does affect the brain, and mental health is no longer an above-the-neck concept. The evolving science that is newer of the gut-brain connection really has helped us unfold that mood-food connection. So food impacts the brain and our mental well-being, and there's more and more mounting evidence around that. And I think that if people stopped only concentrating on food for their waistline or family history of, say, diabetes, all of which is important, they'd actually appreciate that their mental well-being is a huge, huge component of it too.
I also put a link down below for 30% off Thrive Market. Thrive Market is an online membership-based grocery store, but if you're looking for fun, kind of healthier options, especially when it comes down to processed food, like you're saying, hey, I would rather opt for Siete chips that are using cassava instead of regular corn chips. Or hey, I want a macaroni and cheese that doesn't have the preservatives in it. Or maybe I want to get some like dehydrated vegetable snacks. It's the place for you. And you can sort by different diet type and all this stuff. They've been a sponsor on this channel for years. So full disclaimer, yes, they're a sponsor, but you supporting them supports this channel. So again, that link is in the top line of the description for 30% off your entire grocery order, plus a free gift when you use that special link down below. So if we were to investigate sort of these foods that have a negative impact on the brain, ranging from neuroinflammation down to other things, what would you say your top 5 foods to avoid are if you're trying to preserve brain health and trying to feel good?
Great. So you won't be surprised by some of them, but many of them, again, people think about more in terms of weight or number on a scale. The first one is added sugars. So, you know, a small amount of sugar from healthy fruit, like my favorite being berries, is one thing. But those added and refined sugars, high fructose corn syrup, the stuff that we really want to limit and avoid actually directly affect the brain. Then there's the processed, ultra-processed sort of junk foods and fast foods. With the fast foods, things like fast food French fries have added sugars to them. You don't taste it, but the research and development actually, once, you know, it's spending a lot of money to make them hyper palatable. So you upsize, and then when you upsize, you eat the whole bag, then you want it the next day. It's all engineered to trick your brain into being hyper palatable. The other reason fast foods are concerning is that they often use cheaper oils to fry the foods. So these are very pro-inflammatory to the gut and therefore the brain. That's another reason. So it's the processed, ultra-processed foods, and the fast foods is another category. The third one is artificial sweeteners. So the diet sodas and often the low-sugar foods have, you know, filled that gap with some of the older artificial sweeteners. Some of the newer ones are there's a little bit, you know, less concerning evidence for them, but the older ones are really still problematic, and they drive anxiety and can be quite concerning in terms of the gut microbiome. They also, another name for them is non-nutritive sweeteners, meaning that they're actually not offering nutrition. They just offer you that sweet taste, and very often they're tricking the body again. So people can sometimes even gain weight, not realizing that they're thinking, well, they're having a low sugar food. Then another category is the unhealthy fats in foods. So we're talking about the trans fats, the hydrogenated oils, the things, you know, think shelf-stable baked goods. You buy it this week and you can serve it next week. Those are the foods we really want to stay away from. And then another category is the processed oils. So this I put in a different category because they are contained in many different foods. Often they labeled vegetable oils, but they have a high level of processed soy oil. And of course, you know, an edamame or an actual soybean is very different from the version of the oil. So that's the distinguishing factor. And those actually are all foods, the top 5 that really drive inflammation in the body as one of the mechanisms.
Now, there's multiple ways that they can impact the brain. I mean, of course, there's sort of the direct impact that they may have as far as inflammation is concerned, that people think about, neuroinflammation, or maybe they think about just lighting up the brain like a Christmas tree, just too much of, umami effect and all of that, just way too much. But you keep coming back to the gut. And is there a link between foods causing inflammation in the gut and that directly causing potential inflammation in the brain?
Yes. So the way that we understand the evolving science around the gut microbiome is that we start off with some basic principles. Actually, start off with embryology. The gut and brain originate from the exact same cells in the developing embryo. They then divide apart, they form these two separate organs, but the two organs, the gut and the brain, then are connected anatomically, physiologically, and biochemically by the 10th cranial nerve, which is the vagus nerve. Now, the vagus nerve is called the wandering nerve in the body. It goes to a lot of places, but it is very much a component of that enteric nervous system, which is one of the reasons that the gut is often called the second brain. When we unpack that a little bit more, we also understand that this is a two-way system, bidirectional. So messages are being transmitted all the time, like text messages going back and forth, but they're often messages of neurotransmitters. So we now understand they're communicating. An additional factor is that a high percentage, like 90 to 95% of serotonin receptors and serotonin production occurs in the gut. So you start to realize, well, as food is being digested, it's also in the environment of these trillions of microbes that live there. And those trillions of microbes are also in the environment of where these receptors and the production of these neurotransmitters is occurring. So you start to slowly see there's this interaction going on. When you further think about it, if you were eating, that fast food diet, the processed, ultra-processed foods as your main staple, then those breakdown products of food, as they are going through digestion, will interact with the microbes, but they're also bad microbes in this environment of the gut microbiome. When the bad microbes thrive, they set up that environment for things like dysbiosis and ultimately inflammation, and lead to a process over time such as leaky gut, which is intestinal permeability. When that single cell lining of the gut is damaged, the leakage of toxins into the circulatory system is all part of the body, right? And they reach the brain. So over time, and I see this clinically, people will have new onset anxiety or an uptick of a symptom that they had. They're suddenly wondering, why is it worse? When you trace it back, one of the things could be a real change in their diet. So you start to develop neuroinflammation over time. The research is always evolving, but I think for me, it's one of the ways that I can unpack that food-mood connection for people, explaining that, what we eat does impact how we feel, because most people don't make that connection.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, are you familiar with the term leaky brain as well?
Yes.
I mean, is that a real thing? I mean, it sounds kind of cheeky, but it seems like there's some actual merit to it.
I do believe there's merit to it. I've heard a lot of my patients say, I've seen it at gastroenterologists, and they roll their eyes and say to me, there's no such thing as leaky gut. And, I feel badly for them, because they've really been almost undermined in terms of what they're experiencing and what they're trying to investigate, and what they're trying to explore on their own health journey. But yes, I do believe that these things exist, and there might be more paradigms of how we explain symptoms or conditions. But the brain is such a delicate organ, and without the brain, the rest of our body doesn't function. So the fact that we, in some ways, worry about it least of all is a concern to me. So I want people to be thinking brain health as part of their overall health, and not just cardiovascular or type 2 diabetes. All of these are important, but they really need to be integrated with our brain.
Yeah. When you mention like ultra-processed foods as well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the things that I've always seemed to find so fascinating is that when you have just this abundance of flavor and sort of overwhelming sensation, you hear the term, like, it lights up your brain. Like, you see some of these fMRI scans where they're like, okay, well, when people eat fast food versus regular food, the brain's just kaboom, just lit up. Yeah. I mean, is that a tactic that food creators use to just get people to want to eat more, to get addicted to it? Like, what's happening there?
So I think that whether they use actual fMRI or they use that data to develop the foods, I'm not 100% sure, but I can tell you that millions of dollars is spent on research and development of these processed, ultra-processed foods and fast foods. And for example, there was this study done in animals published in March of 2022. And it actually showed that there was this thickener called carboxymethyl cellulose. So it's used to thicken foods, CMC for short. And it impacted the production of short-chain fatty acids in the gut of these in the animal study. So they believe they were mice. So it was one of those things that actually showed that direct link. You eat those foods, there's less short-chain fatty acids. And what do we want to produce, or what do we want to have those microbes produce? One of the things is short-chain fatty acids. So if you build along that, you start to understand that things like tapping into our cravings, making those foods hyper palatable. You want to reach for them, and then you want to reach for them again, whether it's a processed chip snack or crunchy snack, or whether it's a fast food. I believe that the industry uses the science behind these to engineer the foods to trick our brain. Because ultimately, their bottom line is making money. It's not our health. So if you're looking to a food company for your health, you might be tricked by the marketing and labeling, because actually they stay within the rules of labeling. But it's often trickery. I mean, you've probably heard, Thomas, that there's 262, at last count, other names for sugar on food labels. There's a repository. And one of my favorites is brown rice syrup, because many people think, it's a better grain. People tell me to eat brown rice. It's actually just sugar. So getting savvy to these tricks is important as a consumer. I feel we need to educate ourselves, because honestly, the food companies, they're there to make money, whether it's a food or beverage company. They may label something to sell it to us as natural, or whatever the word is, low sugar, the multiple labels. But it's up to us to know a little bit more. And it's not to place a burden on the consumer, but it really is for our own health, and we need to be our own health advocates, because they're not gonna tell us tell us the secrets.
I mean, trans fats is a perfect example on labels too. It's like, we've quote unquote outlawed trans fats.
Yes.
But in an effort to circumnavigate that, they just changed the serving sizes so that, because you're allowed to have a certain amount of trans fats.
That's exactly what I'm referring to. They don't mislabel, because there are laws around that in the United States. But there's simple things like the percent or the amount or the quantity, and that's exactly how that's how we get the wrong message. We think, there's zero, but actually it's very seldom zero.
Do you mentioned seed oils, and I want to have a point of clarity with that. Like, there's such a difference between eating a handful of almonds or a handful of macadamia nuts and getting seed or nut oils and industrialized seed oils. But in case people that are watching or listening just are unfamiliar with that, and just so they don't get the wrong idea, what is the difference? Because you mentioned that as one of the ones that can definitely impact your brain.
Right. So the way that I understand the difference is that, it's very different when you eat an actual food, right? One of the principles in nutritional psychiatry is eat the orange or eat the almond, skip the processed version of it, right? So orange juice from a store usually has most of the fiber stripped, and fiber is super important from the orange, and has added sugar. But, if you eat the orange, you're getting all the nutrients, the micronutrients and the vitamins that it comes with, and the fiber. In a similar way, whether it's macadamia or almond or any of these, some of them are more, the ones that I worry about with the processed, or some of the palm seed, the processed soybean and things like that. When it comes to seed oil, the processed version of it just is not quite the same as eating the fiber in the nut and those nutrients. So what I would do is be cautious about how and when you use them. For example, in culinary school, we use a lot of those interesting oils as a finishing oil, or to up the flavor of something in a dressing. They're not necessarily something you cook or fry or roast with. So using the flavor in moderation is not bad, but it's when you see it on food labels and it's a very processed version of it, or if that's the oil with which you're cooking, that's when I want you to be super careful.
Gotcha. I'm not sure if this is an area that you've looked at, but I've seen some people talk about potentially even the impact of like seed oils on endocannabinoid receptors and how they might possibly, in these higher concentrations, make us want to eat more or kind of get this level of almost satisfaction from them.
I've actually seen that too, and it's not an area that I've researched heavily, but I've seen that, and it's another reason that you're absolutely right. They're a little bit more problematic. So being cautious about them. People don't always like my saying this, Thomas, but I'll say that for most foods, my view on this is that I want people to eat more foods than less, but more healthy foods. So it's not necessarily about the calories, it's the quality of the food. So you might have a touch of something in a salad dressing. That's okay, but it's not, I just don't want you to depend on that oil for everything in your food. And that's because, the flavor is also important, but just don't overly use those. The ones that we know are better are the ones we should be leaning into. And my favorite are some things like extra virgin olive oil for things like salad dressings, avocado oil. If you say roasting some vegetables, I use a touch of ghee. Culturally, I grew up eating that, and I think it's delicious. So it's a great way to add flavor to your food, and I really use much less, if any, of the other ones.
Well, let's talk ghee for just a second, because we share that love of ghee.
Yeah.
And ghee, that has short chain fatty acids in it directly, right? It's already got a decent amount of butyrate. I think out of all the fats in it, it's got a.
It's a great product, and it's delicious. I feel it's a healthy option, and I think it's been a little bit demonized because of our almost an evolution of our understanding of the data around saturated fats, and not. Most of my cardiology friends don't agree with me, but I do feel we need to look at where the science is evolving. So I actually say to my patients, use a touch of butter, use a touch of ghee if you know how to make it or you know how to buy it, or just a piece of butter. It's okay, we don't have to, you don't have to avoid it altogether.
Yeah, I think where we start running into problems with saturated fat are just like anything else. When you're in excess and you're already in a state of overnutrition, you're already in a caloric surplus, then it's like you look at the literature, everything becomes monumentally more bad for you when you're already in a surplus.
You are correct on that, because it's about our, for want of a better term, sort of our metabolic fitness, right? And we know that our metabolic health is a concern in the United States. We know that more people than not are metabolically unfit. So you're completely right about that, because if we're starting off with with the problem with weight or metabolic health, your body's going to respond differently to when you are in good shape and working out and like at a good overall health. Very different. Your body's going to respond very differently. So that's key too.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, because it's just like, I think a healthy body can be resilient to some of these things when you have a touch of them. I think sometimes people get the wrong idea that if they have a tablespoon of seed oils, they're going to just blow up or something.
Right. You're right about that, and that's why I mentioned the sort of culinary, because this is when I used these oils, and at that time I wasn't as savvy to the nutrition around them, but I also remember we used small amounts, like less than a teaspoon or teaspoon in a dressing or to finish a dish, but the flavor was very powerful. So I always think to myself, I want people to be more inclusive than restrictive, because that restrictive mindset, I'm not saying we shouldn't slowly cut back on those foods that are not good for us, but I think that restrictive mindset is what leads to what I see as a sort of a boomerang effect, because someone will come back having restricted something or arrive on my doorstep feeling like now that's all they can eat is the stuff that they were restricting. Then they struggle with their weight and their metabolic health, but most importantly, their mental health as well. So.
The next question is a little bit more your opinion, so it doesn't have to necessarily be rooted in any solid evidence. But I'm curious your thoughts on this. Like, if you had to say, like, metabolic syndrome, metabolic issues in general, just metabolic mitochondrial dysfunction, do you think it starts more in the brain, or do you think it starts more in the body?
It's a great one. I I would say it probably starts in the body and impacts the brain. And I could be wrong. There could be new evidence about that. But I feel like, to me, that makes more sense. And yet, there are things like the way in which immune cells affect the gut and therefore impact conditions like anxiety because they're related to it gets so complicated. But anyway, the short answer is I think it starts in the body, but I stand to be wrong.
Yeah, no, agreed. I mean, I think there was an interesting paper, I think I did a video on it, a few weeks ago, talking about like obesity as a potential, genetic polymorphisms or monomorphisms, and it had a really good point when you're looking at this literature. It's like these genetic issues with obesity, genetic predispositions to obesity, it takes more than hundreds of years to develop these mutations. And it's like, okay, well, these gene mutations that may be a cause for obesity were likely around 100 years ago. We just didn't have the environment of ultra-processed foods and whatnot to sort of trigger it, right? It's like because if you were to take a person with genetic predisposition to obesity and someone without and put them in two different environments altogether, if you're not exposed to additional food and additional calories and additional intake, it's not like the polymorphisms are going to make you magically become obese.
Good point.
So, I mean, it just kind of echoes your sentiments on that. It's just like, okay, I think a lot of it does start with still like the food that's around us, but then the food that's around us is also, we're getting kind of tricked in the head. So it's kind of like, which one comes first?
Which one comes first? And I'll tell you, many people have been asking me about, why is it that in the last, say, let's just take 2 decades, but some people make it a shorter period. Why is it that things like ADHD, autism, but specific conditions in mental health have just, increased? I mean, we know that post-pandemic anxiety is increased by 25%, published in The Lancet. We know that suicide is on the rise. And in fact, the LA Times recently had a really good piece about the 2022 data being increased because of the older individuals, so geriatric population, suicide had increased. So we know in mental health, those are the glaring ones. But I often go back to what's changed in our environment. Well, the food has changed, and the food has gotten more and more processed and ultra-processed. And it is what we're eating. So I feel like it's not the only thing, but it's one of the things we should be looking at even in those conditions.
I'm not sure if there's literature on this or not, but maybe like since the pandemic have we had like a hockey stick in our processed food intake? I would imagine that could have catapulted a lot of people into starting to eat like that more.
It's interesting you asked that. So I do know a few things about it. In March 2020, there are a lot of people many people in the world, including in the U.S., panicked because it was the first time in our lives that we saw empty store shelves, empty parts of the grocery store, and people were very panicked. And there was definitely an uptick, in data showed that, in processed food sales. So in fact, some companies went back and started to manufacture more things like canned soups and processed snacks. And that trend of increased processed sales increased throughout the pandemic, and it still has not gone back to pre-pandemic times. And I feel like that has definitely impacted things. How can I not put it together? There isn't a study to show this, but how can I not put that together with the fact that we ran short of Zoloft, sertraline, early on in the pandemic, and continued to be a problem. But fortunately, for those people prescribed it, they were able to get it eventually. But there has to be an association. I can't ignore that. And I feel like one of the big things that happened, of the many, horrible things that happened during the pandemic, our food habits changed. People did things like not only just had found comfort in ice cream every night or cookies or some sort of processed snack, but it's also, you might maybe go out to work dinner or go out with your friends on a Friday and have a glass of wine. People were having a bottle of wine at dinner, It was different. There was just this whole really the loneliness, the isolation, the mental aspect of it was very hard to endure. So people reached out for things, and I feel like we're at a point where how do we walk ourselves back from some of those habits and understand it was a tough time, but what do we do now?
Yeah, I mean, you look at DoorDash, and people just get accustomed to that, and just even the little teeny things that people may not think about. But the 1,500 extra steps you would have walked to go get in your car, drive to go pick up the food, walk into this. You know what I mean? It's just like
all those little things
add up.
Yeah, people were very isolated. We were very much. I agree with you. We were very much indoors. Even just commuting to work. Many people, used a train or whatever their method of transportation. Even at work, they were walking. And at work, they may have been eating healthier choices because the cafeteria may have a salad bar. Whereas if you have the choice and going to DoorDash, you may not choose the salad. So.
And simply environment. If you're at home and you have your pantry at your disposal, we all know the pantry isn't exactly full of the best stuff. And at least you go to work and maybe you've got a different pantry there, but maybe it's not stocked full of all the things that you love and enjoy and you bought for a reason.
Right. And you're going to reach out for, in the middle of your Zoom meetings or whatever it is. So.
Is there truth to the element of food as comfort physiologically, or is it predominantly trauma-based, psychological? Like when we look at people that really seek comfort from food, is it because it's something that helps them cope, something that they dealt with when they were younger and they ingrain these habits, or are there actual things that happen inside the body when certain foods are consumed that help people just temporarily feel better?
So it's a little bit of both, and let me try and unpack it a little bit. So with conditions like trauma and other most really serious mental health conditions, it could be the conditioning, the psychology of eating around a negative experience, or a child who was exposed to whatever type of trauma, who reached out for a type of food that was comforting because it soothed them in a certain way, or it was a way to kind of distance themselves or dissociate themselves from a very negative situation they were in. So there's that emotional component, but there's also the physiology behind it. If you think about it, when, one of the things I talk about, and again, comfort, a little bit of comfort food is fine, but let's not kind of confuse ourselves, because comfort food is discomfort for the brain. And, so all I'm saying is we shouldn't be eating it every day. And when we eat, say, things like, this is where it can be confusing. If you eat, say, sugary donut, or say that piece of a candy bar, in order for the conversion, so one of the things that happens is that we need a certain amount of carbohydrate to transport tryptophan across the brain to make the serotonin. And there's often a little bit of a nice feeling when you have, say, that donut or whatever it is. But unfortunately, it also is related to the levels of sugar that get formed in our body and brain. And over time, there's damage to the neurons. So it's not straightforward. It's a little bit more complicated. There is, in fact, this nice feeling that you have, but it's short-lived. And you may have that donut again. But the truth is that ultimately, over time, it's not good for your brain. So that's what I mean. It's an overly simplistic way to say that it's ultimately not good for your brain. So once in a while, I prefer for people to have cake on their birthday rather than not have cake and then a week later say, I'm getting to the fridge and I'm going to eat the whole cake, because I've seen it happen. So I'd rather they modulate what they do. Is it a great food? No. But we shouldn't demonize it, because then I know the emotional impact it has on them. And I my lens is always through mental health and mental well-being. So I sort of have to account for what is the short-term effect versus the long-term effect. So that's why I say, look, it's not comfort for your brain. It's actually discomfort for your brain. So do it, have the cake on your birthday. And, that kind of stuff.
I've kind of found the same thing, like sustainability-wise. It's like doing this for a long time and like trying to stay in the perfect kind of shape that I need to be in for camera and this and that. And I realized, like, for a long time I would go very restrictive, and then I would find myself, I think any person, no matter the level of willpower, when you restrict, eventually there's a propensity to binge and like to want to go all the way.
Or want to go all the way, or have more of it,
And I've noticed that like, for me, it's like, you know what, let yourself have that little piece of gluten-free cookie and just have a little bit every day or every other day, you know, and just get it out of your system. And I find like the overall aggregate of how much I consume of that stuff is about half.
It's much, much less. I completely agree with you on that. You know, everyone has to have their little go-tos for what they feel is that short-term sort of positive effect. Because we know that it has that effect, we also just know that you shouldn't be eating the whole bag of cookies. Now, that may happen on one day, Thomas. I mean, I don't know. Maybe you might need a bag of cookies. Again, you know, research on spices actually shown something interesting. They showed that it happened to have spices involved, that when you are regretful and feeling badly and berating yourself, so this emotional component after you've eaten something, it actually impacts the absorption of a positive substance like a spice. So what I think is really curious is I try to remind myself of this, you know, you have your bad days, you have a stressful day, or I remember my days as an intern, I was a horrible eater. You know, I would be running and eating on the go and not even sitting down, forgetting to drink water. But I also know that I had to teach myself those healthy habits again. So none of us is perfect, but if we can have that sort of having grace with ourselves and saying, hey, a little bite of this cookie makes me feel good today, I'm still living my healthier life, you know, it's that balance is so key for it to be sustainable.
Yeah, I mean, that's truly the essence of having a healthy relationship with food, where you can be around it and not
have all of it.
Not have all of it, right? And that's hard for a lot of people. And I mean, arguably, it's very difficult with ultra-processed food because they're designed to just make you want to eat the whole bag.
So have you ever been in front of a bag of potato chips or, you know, other favorite American snack? They are designed to be that way. What I find is a kicker is when the fast foods start to add the processed food snacks into their meals. It's like a double whammy, and I think, well, of course it's going to be delicious, you know. But it's like a double. It's like a double hit on us.
Like a Dorito Crunch Wrap, where they're taking
I was thinking of that, and I think they did it with their fries, something like that. And I was thinking, wow, this is like a double whammy for us. It's very hard.
I saw there's now Cheeto or Flaming Hot Cheetos macaroni and cheese.
Oh, I haven't seen that.
I was like, seen that. What's next? Are we going to add like M&Ms to it too?
Yeah, exactly. Why did we throw that in? Well, we had it. Yeah.
And it kind of goes to show. I mean, it's like that. If you were to put that in front of someone 300 years ago, I wonder what their response would be. Not just. I mean, I'm sure the gastroenterologist. I mean, like from that perspective, I'm sure it wouldn't be a good response. But would they even eat it? Would they look at it and be like, what on earth? Like, take a bite and does it just like send them into this stratosphere, you know?
It's so true. And that's the exact, it's funny how sometimes like everyone wants to be, you know, like we are in the US. Like many countries just aspire to have the fast foods that we have. And the fast food chains in countries outside of here have actually led to obesity in their children. But the funny thing is, within our own system, food has really evolved, and that industrialization process has taken away the nutrients. And so you're right. I mean, I think about how my grandparents ate, it was completely different. And I don't even think they knew what a lot of the stuff that I eat is, you know, so.
Do you think that if we all just, in a perfect world, perfect situation where we could flip a switch, if we ate just whole foods, like regardless of carbohydrate count, regardless of fat content, protein, if we just had a plethora of wholesome food with no processed foods, do you think that we would sort of naturally self-govern how much we eat? Do you think that we would like probably eat ad libitum and not really have a problem? I mean, again, it's your opinion, so I feel free to.
It is an opinion, and I appreciate that question. I actually feel that our bodies are smart enough to self-regulate. Because if you're eating whole foods, you would probably, firstly, your metabolism would be better in check. And things like your satiety signals would work. You wouldn't develop things like leptin resistance. And so you'd have a plate of food and, you'd feel, oh, this is great. And you move on. Then maybe you have your lunch or your dinner, or depending on how many meals you eat, you'd feel okay. The hijacking of our taste buds, our centers for craving, how we feel, the hyperpalatability has really changed all of that, because I feel like the body is really smart enough to self-regulate, and people know when they're full. I've had enough. I don't need seconds, or I don't need a snack in between. And you consume fewer calories. Now, a lot of database studies have shown that when we cook our meals at home and we eat at home, we consume fewer calories and we tend to lose weight over time. Not a massive amount, but it's just there's a trend. So I would say that if we were just eating actual food, real food, we would probably be in overall better condition in terms of our metabolic health. And I think there would still be some sort of course, variation of people who struggle a little bit with weight, people who may be underweight and struggle with eating, and then, a lot of the people in between who are generally okay.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree with that too. And I think you've probably seen this study. I mean, it's monkey data, so we can't take it to the bank, but it's one of my favorite studies to look at just because it's thought-provoking. Mm-hmm. You've probably seen it. I think it's the Nutrient study, where it takes essentially monkeys that were eating not very nutritious monkey chow. When they restricted calories in those monkeys, it elicited a positive impact. But if they tried restricting calories in essentially monkeys that were eating whole foods, it didn't really have much impact. And what it essentially was illuminating was that, like, if you're eating garbage, at that point, caloric restriction makes a pretty big impact. Yeah. But if you're eating wholesome food, caloric restriction doesn't make as much of an impact. And it was just it opened my eyes and thinking, like, wow, like caloric restriction and like consciously restricting calories, albeit important, that's a very modern thing.
Yes.
Like it's a very modern thing to keep a spreadsheet of your food or use an app. We didn't have to do that. And it's kind of funny. It's like now we have the ability to do that, and obesity is at all-time highs.
Yeah.
And 100 years ago, or even 50, 60 years ago, we didn't really have as much of a means of doing that.
Yeah.
Yet we were leaner.
Yeah.
It's wild.
Yeah. I mean, when I think back again to I had the fortune, when I was little, I had both my grandparents and my great-grandparents around. And they may not have known what a calorie was. They may have understood something about it, but they just ate regular meals, regular whole foods, and none of them were overweight. And they didn't have serious health issues, so it's just interesting when you think about that for a second.
Is there, like, when you look at mental health with, say, your grandparents, great-grandparents compared to now, are there studies that adjust for the data suggesting like that maybe less people were getting diagnosed because they weren't getting tested and they weren't looking at these things? Like, even with that data taken into account, I would imagine like we're still higher than we were 50, 60 years ago.
Right. So I can speak to the study. There's a lot of talk in the conditions like autism and those types of conditions that we are testing and looking and doing more research now. And for that reason, we feel like we are diagnosing it more. I don't know that we have, firstly, I think that mental health data on its own is challenged, because I think the system of how we diagnose is challenged. So DSM-5 TR captures diagnostic categories, but unlike if someone came into my office with a bad cough or chest infection, I could do an x-ray, I could order sputum, I could try to find out what organism we need to treat. We can't do that in mental health. So I think on its own, just the diagnostic system and how we figure out what's going on with someone is challenged. So as I preface that, I'm also wanting to make the point that food is medicine, and since we have to eat, we eat a few meals a day at least, or whatever your eating pattern is, you are eating. And therefore, it is one factor that you can improve on your own. You know what you like, you can eat more whole foods, you know if you have an allergy or intolerance, and you can actually make an effective change from that. So I feel like many people overlook the power at the end of their fork. You know, they kind of think, well, I have to count the calories, track in the app, and you know what? If that has helped you, well and good. Some people can, and some people can't do that. You know, so.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Naidoo, I mean, where can everyone find you and your book and everything?
Thank you. So you can find me at umanaidoomd.com. My book is called Calm Your Mind with Food, and it comes out on December 26th of this year, 2023. And my first book is called This Is Your Brain on Food. And follow me on social media where you'll find all my content, which is at DRUMANAIDOO.
Perfect. Well, we'll link out to all that below as well as your new book. And,
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks so much.